Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the hidden world of castle toilets, where waste dropped straight into moats, servants cleaned cesspits that could explode, and hygiene was more superstition than science. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe put on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1325. The good news, you're a noble. The bad news, that means you're about to discover why castles smelled less like wealth and more like fermented despair. Your chamber is grand by medieval standards. High ceilings, heavy drapes, tapestries depicting knights and saints, all of which are doing an impressive job of trapping centuries of damp air and mystery odours. Beneath your bare feet, the rushes on the floor are several months old, a fragrant mixture of straw, flower petals, and everything that's fallen on it since last winter. The air is cold, heavy, and faintly sour. You don't see it yet, but somewhere behind one of these stone walls is the most dangerous hole in medieval architecture, the garderobe. You shuffle toward it half awake, wearing a nightshirt that smells faintly of beeswax and regret. The garderobe is a narrow stone cubicle built right into the outer wall of the castle. Inside, there's a small bench with a round hole carved into it. No seat, no privacy, no mercy. The opening leads straight down a vertical shaft, a medieval plumbing innovation that drops everything directly into the moat below. And if that moat happens to surround your castle's kitchen garden, well, let's just say you're technically composting. This system might sound primitive, but it was actually a marvel of engineering for its time. The concept dates back to the 12th century and was considered high-class sanitation. Only the wealthy could afford such a convenient way to let gravity handle their business. The name garderobe literally means to guard robes, because nobles believed the fumes rising from the shaft would keep fleas and lice away from their clothes. So yes, they stored their finest garments above a medieval sewer. It's hard to decide which is worse, the smell or the logic. As you sit on the cold stone, you realise the castle's silence is deceptive. Beneath your feet, the moat is alive, not with fish, but with the byproducts of centuries of human creativity and digestive distress. Many moats doubled as open cesspools brimming with waste, bacteria, and a faint shimmer of rainbow-coloured slime. During summer, the smell could travel for miles. There are even records of castle guards fainting during heat waves. But for nobles, this was luxury. The peasants down in the village had to make do with chamber pots, buckets, or just the nearest alleyway. Now let's talk about the people whose job it was to deal with all of this. The gong farmers. These poor souls cleaned out cesspits and garderobe shafts, often by torchlight, waist deep in human waste. It was so dangerous that they were legally required to work at night, partly for modesty, partly because methane build-up sometimes caused explosions. Yes, castle toilets could literally blow up. In fact, there's a famous case from 1183 when a German king and his nobles were having a meeting in a latrine tower that collapsed, killing everyone inside. The chronicles called it divine punishment. Historians call it what it was, a plumbing accident. Perfume became the medieval substitute for hygiene. Nobles doused themselves and their rooms in rosewater, musk or vinegar, believing strong scents could purify the air. Of course, this didn't stop the spread of disease. The same castles that hosted lavish feasts were often crawling with bacteria. In some royal courts, incense burned constantly, masking the odour, but filling the halls with smoke thick enough to sting your eyes. It wasn't just unpleasant. It was the medieval version of living in a heavily perfumed gas chamber. But the real horror wasn't the smell, it was the contamination. Many castle moats drained into nearby rivers, the same rivers used for drinking water. So, when a noble raised a silver goblet of fresh stream water, they were often toasting with the essence of last week's dinner. Typhoid, dysentery, and cholera ran rampant, killing nobles and servants alike. Yet the superstition of the time blamed the air itself. Miasma, they called it, rather than the contents of their moats. which means no one thought to stop dumping waste into them. You shift uncomfortably on your stone seat, realizing that the wind whistling up from the shaft is colder than a ghost's breath. The smell is so thick you can almost taste it, a mix of damp limestone, old wine, and something unholy. You suddenly understand why medieval candles were so heavily scented, and as you finish, you have one final realization. There's no toilet paper. Nobles wiped with scraps of linen or handfuls of moss. The truly fancy might have used wool, while the thrifty reused whatever they could. And yes, sometimes that meant a communal cloth. When you stand, you notice a rack of fine robes hanging nearby. Their rich dyes gleam in the torchlight, but they too carry a faint undertone of ammonia. Congratulations, your clothes have been fumigated by your own waste fumes. You're now flea-free and 10% more tragic than when you started. You step back into the castle hallway, taking a deep breath of the marginally less awful air. Somewhere outside you can hear the splash of the moat. Somewhere below, a gong farmer is earning his hazard pay. And somewhere in the kitchens, a servant is drawing water from a source that no one should ever drink from. You might think the nobles had it all: wealth, power, and castles that touched the sky. But when nature called, they were just as human as everyone else, maybe worse. Because no amount of perfume, gold, or divine blessing can mask the fact that every castle in medieval Europe was basically a giant echoing outhouse. And if you think that's disgusting, wait until you find out what they used instead of soap. You step out of the royal garderobe and back into the chill of the stone corridor. The air feels fresher now, though that's not saying much. Every castle had its own unique bouquet of odours, a complex perfume of burning tallow, rotting rushes, and the faint whisper of something that might once have been food. You've survived the medieval toilet, but don't get too confident. Because in a castle, the waste didn't stop after you stood up. It continued to live, breathe, and ferment right beneath your feet. Let's talk about the cesspits, the dark underworld of medieval sanitation. Beneath the floors of the castle, these pits collected everything from human waste to kitchen scraps, chamber pot contents, and sometimes the occasional unlucky rat. These weren't small either. Some were the size of modern swimming pools, and they were never fully emptied. Instead, layers built upon layers, turning centuries of royal leftovers into a bubbling geological formation of horror. When archaeologists excavate old castles today, these pits are gold mines of information, though gold might be the wrong word. They've found jewellery, coins, pottery, and even entire meals preserved in the muck. It's the medieval version of time travel if you can handle the smell. Cesspits had their own class system too. The grander the castle, the more elaborate the waste collection. Some had multi-chambered pits designed to slowly drain liquid through stone filters, which is impressive until you realise those filters usually emptied into nearby rivers or wells. The same water sources used for cooking and drinking. So when the kitchen staff ladled soup into a noble's bowl, it often contained more family history than anyone wanted. Contamination was rampant, but since the concept of germs wouldn't exist for another 5 centuries, people blamed everything else. Bad air, evil spirits, the alignment of Mars, anything except the fact that their water supply had a suspicious aftertaste. Now let's talk about the brave souls tasked with managing these subterranean nightmares. Gong farmers, the sanitation workers of the Middle Ages. Their job was to climb into these pits with shovels, buckets, and a profound lack of self-preservation. They worked mostly at night to avoid offending the delicate sensibilities of the upper classes. A gong farmer's life expectancy wasn't great. Methane build-up could suffocate them, and in some cases, an ill-placed torch could turn the entire pit into an inferno. Yet they were paid surprisingly well, sometimes earning more than craftsmen or soldiers. It's almost as if society quietly acknowledged that some jobs deserve hazard pay, especially when your workplace occasionally explodes. The cesspits themselves could become architectural hazards. Castle walls sometimes collapsed when the waste-filled chambers underneath grew too heavy or eroded the foundations. There are records of nobles being awakened in the night by the sudden sound of a wall crumbling and the unmistakable aroma of judgment. Builders tried to reinforce the pits with stone, but moisture and ammonia ate away at everything over time. Some castles even had multiple garderobes funneling into one pit, creating medieval plumbing networks so ambitious they would make modern engineers weep, mostly from the smell. There's something poetic about it, though. These grand fortresses were designed to withstand sieges, arrows and fire, but not digestion. When historians say castles fell from within, they usually mean politics or betrayal. But in some cases it was literally the waste management system giving up. You can almost imagine a medieval architect standing proudly beside his blueprint, explaining how the moat doubles as defence and disposal. No one ever asked what happens when it rains, and the answer was flooded bathrooms. And speaking of flooding, that brings us to the next great problem of medieval sanitation: weather. Rainwater often seeped through cracks and mixed with the waste in cesspits, turning them into foul, overflowing bogs that could seep through floors and walls. In some winters, castle residents would abandon certain rooms entirely because the smell became unbearable. Servants sprinkled herbs, burned juniper branches, and hung perfumed cloths in doorways, but it only helped so much. The noble solution was simple: build another castle somewhere else. If you think this was unique to Europe, think again. Across the world, similar systems existed in different forms. Ancient Romans had public latrines that were communal by design, and while they at least had running water, they also shared sponge sticks for cleaning. By medieval standards, that was practically cutting-edge technology. But once the Roman Empire fell, sanitation regressed spectacularly. The Middle Ages inherited the ruins of Rome but forgot the plumbing, replacing aqueducts with moats and marble baths with buckets. Progress apparently is not linear. It's no wonder disease thrived. The average medieval city was a living laboratory for bacteria. Waste from cesspits and streets seeped into wells. Latrines were sometimes built too close to kitchens, and yet, people still insisted that cleanliness was suspiciously vain. Bathing was rare because doctors believed it opened the pores to illness. A strange philosophy, considering how much illness was literally crawling up from the floor. In fact, when the Black Death swept across Europe in the 14th century, filthy conditions made it unstoppable. The plague didn't just kill people, it revealed how deeply humanity misunderstood hygiene. You might expect all this to have driven someone to invent a better system, but innovation took centuries. Toilets remained simple holes in walls or wooden boxes until the 16th century, when Sir John Harrington, a godson of Queen Elizabeth I, invented a flushing toilet. It had a cistern, a handle, and a surprisingly modern design. Unfortunately, it didn't catch on. People found the concept wasteful, and the Queen herself used it only occasionally. So the world continued using garderobes and chamber pots for another 200 years. History, it seems, doesn't move forward until it absolutely has to. As you wander deeper through the castle, the smell of incense drifts through the corridor again. It's thick and sweet, trying to smother centuries of organic truth. You can almost see the illusion of grandeur cracking like old plaster. Every banquet above had its counterpart below, every feast its echo in the cesspit. And in that contrast lies the entire truth of medieval nobility. Power meant comfort, but comfort had its cost. You turn a corner and find yourself staring at another narrow stone cubicle built into the wall, another garderobe, identical to the one you left earlier, yet somehow even darker, even colder. You realise how many there must have been. For nobles, servants, guests, each one feeding into the same system beneath your feet. Each one an unspoken part of medieval life. And with every passing year, the castle filled just a little more. The torchlight flickers, the air grows heavier again. Somewhere below, you can almost hear the faint bubbling of history fermenting in the dark. And as you take a cautious step back from the edge, you start to wonder what other secrets these castles were hiding. Because if this was how they handled waste, imagine what passed for medicine. The torchlight flickers on the rough stone walls as you make your way deeper into the castle, and you begin to notice something strange. Every passage seems to whisper with the faint echo of dripping water. Somewhere nearby, a pipe is leaking, or perhaps not a pipe at all. Because this isn't plumbing as you know it. This is the castle's hidden digestive system, an intricate maze of chutes, shafts, and secret holes designed to carry royal waste away from view. What no one mentions on castle tours is that the real engineering marvel of the Middle Ages wasn't just the drawbridge or battlements. It was figuring out how to get rid of what came out of a noble's backside without destroying the castle in the process. You'd think these systems were primitive, but in some ways they were surprisingly clever. Castles like Dover, Rochester and Edinburgh had garderobe towers built directly into the outer walls so gravity could do the work. Waste fell down through vertical shafts, often running behind the masonry, and out into a moat or deep pit. The architects even angled the chutes so that heavy rainfall could flush them occasionally. That was the medieval equivalent of plumbing maintenance, otherwise known as let the rain sort it out. The problem was that when it didn't rain for weeks, things backed up, literally. There are records from the 13th century of royal masons being paid to scrape and repair waste shafts that had burst through the walls. Imagine spending your career patching holes caused by royal digestion, and the design wasn't always foolproof. Some garderobes emptied into hidden corners of the courtyard where drainage was poor. Over time, these became stagnant ponds of decay that castle servants pretended not to notice. Archaeologists have found layers of organic sludge mixed with kitchen refuse, bones and broken pottery. That's not just trash, it's data. From it, historians have learned what nobles ate, what they threw away, and occasionally what they lost down the hole. Rings, belt buckles, coins, and even small religious charms have all been recovered from medieval cesspits. Nothing says eternal devotion like accidentally dropping your cross into the moat. The smell of waste may have been universal, but how people managed it varied wildly depending on rank. The higher your status, the more elaborate your facilities. Some kings had private garderobes with wooden seats carved to fit their royal anatomy. In certain castles, these rooms were even heated by small fireplaces built into the walls. Imagine that. A warmed toilet in the 1300s, while peasants outside were freezing in their huts. The same kings who fought wars over land were also fighting daily battles against constipation. Chronic indigestion was common among nobles thanks to diets heavy in meat, ale, and very little fibre. Medieval doctors believed flatulence released poisonous vapours, which they considered essential for maintaining good health. So technically, yes, your royal rear end was part of medieval medicine. One of the most bizarre hygiene beliefs involved the idea that the smell of excrement was somehow protective. Many nobles thought the odour purified the air by warding off bad spirits. It's the same logic that led people to carry pomanders, little metal spheres filled with herbs and spices, to mask the smell of everyday life. Of course, this didn't protect anyone from disease, but it did make everyone smell like a cinnamon-scented corpse. The real danger wasn't in the air anyway, it was in the water. Castles often collected rainwater in cisterns built above or near the garderobes, meaning contamination was practically guaranteed. When outbreaks of dysentery occurred, no one blamed sanitation. They blamed fate, witches, or the wrath of God. Now, step into the kitchens, and you'll see how waste and food lived uncomfortably close together. Most kitchens had drains that emptied into the same trenches as the latrines. Everything, fish guts, animal fat and household waste, flowed into the same channels. During winter, these froze solid, creating grotesque sculptures of medieval recycling. By spring, when the thaw came, it all began to move again, and the castle transformed into a biological orchestra of dripping, squelching misery. Servants sprinkled rushes and herbs on the floors to mask the stench, but nothing could disguise the fact that hygiene was more an illusion than a reality. To understand why no one fixed this, you need to look at how medieval people thought about waste. The idea of cleanliness was moral, not medical. Bathing too often was considered decadent or sinful, especially by the church, which warned that nakedness tempted the devil. Cleanliness came from purity of the soul, not soap. So the same people who built chapels and collected relics thought nothing of defecating above a moat filled with rotten fish. When you see how castles were built, it becomes clear that the human body wasn't an afterthought. It was a structural hazard. And yet, there were attempts at improvement. Monasteries often led the way in sanitation design. Monks believed spiritual discipline included hygiene. So many abbeys built sophisticated latrines over running water. The monks of Fountains Abbey in England even constructed an underground drainage system that would make a civil engineer proud. It worked well enough that parts of it still exist today. Ironically, monks had cleaner bathrooms than kings. The difference was that monks saw sanitation as part of order and balance, while nobles saw it as something to perfume away. Over time, the garderobe became more than just a necessity. It became a status symbol. Having multiple toilets in a castle meant wealth and modernity. Some nobles went so far as to decorate their garderobes with carved stone seats or tapestries. Privacy was still rare though. Servants might assist by holding candles or fetching water, and if you were a ruler, there was often an official whose job was to attend your every visit. The groom of the stool. A man trusted with both royal secrets and royal hygiene. He managed the monarch's bowel movements, kept records of their diet, and sometimes became one of the most powerful figures in the court. There's something profoundly humbling about that. The might of an empire could hinge on a man who handled the king's toilet schedule. In some cases, this trust went too far. Court records show that the groom of the stool was occasionally bribed for influence. Access to the royal posterior was, quite literally, political access. It's the kind of fact that reminds you history isn't just about wars and treaties, it's about the everyday absurdities that shape them. Imagine whispering state secrets in a room that smells faintly of vinegar and despair. It happened more often than you'd think. You wander back toward the courtyard, and the air feels cleaner again, though only slightly. You can almost sense the weight of centuries pressing through the stones beneath you, where waste once flowed like a hidden river. The garderobe shafts are silent now, filled in with mortar long ago, but the legacy remains. Medieval castles were masterpieces of architecture, art and ambition. Yet beneath all that grandeur was a constant reminder that even kings were ruled by biology. As the wind whistles through the corridors, you catch the faint scent of something sweet and metallic, like old incense mixed with damp earth. Maybe it's your imagination, or maybe it's history exhaling. You glance toward the narrow stairwell that leads downward, into the heart of the castle's old plumbing system. The air grows colder, thicker. Somewhere below, stone tunnels twist and vanish into darkness. It's a labyrinth built for waste, forgotten by time but essential to life itself. You take a deep breath, steady yourself, and start descending. Because beneath every royal throne was another kind of throne entirely, and you're about to find out where it led next. The stairwell narrows as you descend, each step slick with condensation from the cold castle air. The faint drip of water echoes through the stone passage, but what you're hearing isn't just moisture. It's the ghost of the castle's plumbing, the trickle of ancient pipes and drains that once carried royal waste to places best left unvisited. Down here, below the throne rooms and banquets, was the medieval castle's true machinery. The hidden world that made daily life possible. The part no one wrote ballads about. You reach the lower level where the stench of centuries still clings to the stone. It's subtle now, muted by time, but unmistakable. This is where waste met water. Many castles were built near natural streams or wells, not only for drinking but also for disposal. Engineers, if one can use that word loosely, designed drainage channels that carried waste away from the castle's base. Unfortunately, away, in medieval terms, often meant 20 feet downhill and into the nearest pond. Some castles in France and England were even constructed with moats, fed directly by rivers. It sounded clever until everyone downstream started dying of mysterious stomach illnesses. In truth, castle plumbing was less about sanitation and more about keeping the smell out of the royal chambers. Everything beyond that was someone else's problem, but not all castles were lazy about it. Some went to extraordinary lengths to control their waste systems. Take Kenilworth Castle in England, for example. Archaeological digs there revealed a network of drains so advanced for the 13th century that they almost qualified as sewers. Waste from garderobes and kitchens was funneled through underground tunnels that used gravity to flush it away during rainstorms. Of course, flush might be generous. It was more like nature taking pity. The system still overflowed during heavy rains, flooding basements and filling lower chambers with sludge. Servants then had to bail it out by hand, a job that was only slightly better than dying in battle. You moved deeper into the passage, torchlight dancing across carved channels in the wall. These grooves once carried wastewater from the castle kitchens. Food scraps, grease, and everything that didn't fit on a plate all flowed the same direction as the contents of the garderobes. Kitchens, in particular, were a nightmare of cross-contamination. Meat juices mixed with bath water, soapy runoff mixed with wine residue. The medieval kitchen smelled like a strange marriage between feast and failure. Yet, for all the chaos, this system worked just enough to keep the nobles alive long enough to complain about it. The workers responsible for keeping these systems running were part engineer, part martyr. In large households, they were known as the scullions, a word that sounds appropriately like something scraped off a pot. They scrubbed, emptied, and cleaned the drains beneath the kitchens, a process that often involved crawling into narrow stone ducts armed only with buckets and hope. Many of them suffered from respiratory illnesses due to ammonia inhalation and constant exposure to rot. But it was honest work, and in medieval logic that meant God would probably reward them later, hopefully with a job that didn't involve scraping sewage off bricks. Even the smell had hierarchy. The nobles might wrinkle their noses at the scent of a cesspit, but the lower ranks grew so used to it that the odour barely registered. Chronic exposure dulled the senses. Some servants described in records from the 14th century would even sleep near the kitchens, directly above drainage channels, because the warmth of fermentation made the floors slightly less cold. Imagine that. The faint warmth from decomposing waste being considered a perk of employment. You pause beside an alcove where the walls are stained darker than the rest. This was likely a sluice chamber, a small compartment where buckets of wastewater were collected before being dumped into the moat. These chambers often doubled as makeshift washrooms for the lower servants, who had nowhere else to bathe. Baths were rare luxuries. In castles that had them, they were enormous wooden tubs hauled into rooms and filled with water heated in cauldrons. The lord might soak first, then his family, then his guests, and finally the servants in whatever was left. It's estimated that one tub of water could serve over a dozen people. So yes, cleanliness was relative. When nobles did bathe, they made it an event. Perfumed oils, rose petals, and scented cloths were added to disguise how old the water actually was. Bathing wasn't just about hygiene, it was performative, a way to display wealth and self-control. Meanwhile, the castle drains groaned under the weight of runoff, mixing soap and sewage into a medieval smoothie that flowed into the same channels as everything else. Bathing may have made people smell better temporarily, but it made the moats smell worse permanently. One of the strangest facts about medieval water systems is how connected everything was. A castle's well, its kitchens and its toilets were often within the same structural complex. Builders didn't fully understand how water travelled underground, so contamination was inevitable. During sieges, when castles had to ration water, people reused what they could. Bath water became laundry water became mop water, and mop water, well, that often ended up back in the cesspit. In desperate times, some even drank from moats filtered through cloth, believing it removed impurities. It didn't. But faith was a strong motivator when thirst set in. You stepped through a low doorway into what was once the castle's undercroft, a storage area for barrels and tools. It's damp and quiet now, but this would have been one of the most important parts of the plumbing system. Barrels caught runoff water for reuse, while trenches lined with stone slabs directed overflow toward the moat. The efficiency was admirable in theory, but in practice it was chaos. Servants constantly fought the encroachment of filth. During long winters, frozen waste blocked channels, forcing people to chip away at the ice with picks. On warmer days, insects and rodents swarmed the drains. Cats were kept in kitchens not for affection, but for pest control. Even the rats couldn't resist a warm, damp castle full of leftovers and royal refuse. What's fascinating is how the design of these sanitation systems influenced warfare. Moats were not just barriers to keep out enemies, but also convenient waste receptacles. In many sieges, attackers would contaminate the moats further by dumping dead animals or corpses into them. The defenders, already dealing with the usual waste runoff, soon faced outbreaks of disease. Archaeological evidence from castles like Harlech and Stirling shows layers of biological waste in moat sediments, proving that medieval warfare was fought not only with swords, but with bacteria. The battlefield began right under your toilet seat, and yet, for all their shortcomings, these systems laid the groundwork for modern sanitation. The concept of waste separation, gravity-fed drainage, and designated disposal areas evolved slowly from castle experiments. The earliest versions of indoor plumbing emerged in monasteries and royal residences, where the demand for comfort outweighed the cost. Over centuries, the garderobe gave way to privies to chamber pots with valves, and finally to the flush toilets of the Renaissance. But in many castles, the original waste shafts still exist, sealed behind stone walls. You look up now, back toward the narrow stairwell that leads to the sunlight above. The castle feels different knowing what lies beneath it. The grandeur, the art, the elegance. They were all built on top of something deeply human. The pipes and drains below these ancient halls are silent reminders that even the most powerful people in history couldn't escape biology. As you make your way up again, the air grows clearer. The torch sputters, leaving faint trails of smoke curling along the stone. You can almost sense the ghost of moisture in the air, the memory of centuries of water, waste, and willpower. Castles were marvels of architecture, but they were also monuments to the human struggle against filth. Every wall tells a story, and some of those stories are far less glamorous than others. By the time you reach the upper corridor, you find yourself wondering how anyone survived here at all. The truth is, they didn't always. Illness was rampant, smells were inescapable, and ignorance was universal. Yet somehow, civilization crawled forward anyway, one flush of rainwater at a time. And while the castle above still gleams in the history books, you now know that its real history flowed quietly below, through stone, through filth, and through every secret passage that no one dared to mention at dinner. You reach the upper corridor again, and the cold air rushes past you like the castle itself is sighing in relief. The flicker of torchlight reveals a narrow wooden door set into the wall, smaller than the others, almost hidden. You push it open and find yourself in a space so cramped it feels more like a cupboard than a room. But this isn't a storage closet. This is another garderobe, one meant not for the nobles, but for the soldiers and guards who patrolled the towers. If royal waste was handled with some attempt at dignity, the soldiers' experience was something else entirely. Castles were filled with hundreds of men living shoulder to shoulder, armed, hungry, and constantly exposed to the elements. When nature called, there was no ceremony, no comfort, and no privacy. The guards' latrines were usually small wooden benches built over narrow shafts, sometimes just a hole leading straight down the outer wall. The smell drifted through the arrow slits, carried by the wind across the ramparts. It was an odour so distinct that even attackers could smell when a castle was occupied. Historians call these waste chutes. Soldiers probably called them something less polite. The military aspect of sanitation in castles is one of those overlooked marvels of medieval life. Waste disposal wasn't just about hygiene, it was about survival. During sieges, the question of where everyone relieved themselves became a matter of strategy. Soldiers couldn't simply leave the walls to find a quiet spot. Instead, waste was collected in barrels, dumped into moats, or sometimes catapulted over the walls to keep morale up on both sides. Archaeological digs near old siege sites have uncovered pits filled with human waste, mixed with broken pottery and animal bones, showing just how desperate conditions became. In long sieges, the smell alone could become a weapon. There's even evidence that waste was deliberately used as part of warfare. In the 12th century, defenders of certain castles were known to toss dung, dead animals, and rotting refuse at attackers. Not only did it demoralise the enemy, but it also spread disease. Imagine marching uphill under a rain of arrows, rocks, and the occasional flying latrine surprise. It wasn't just psychological warfare, it was biological. Modern scientists have found traces of parasitic eggs in ancient soil samples around castles like Rochester and Dover, proving that disease wasn't accidental, it was tactical. Soldiers themselves didn't fare much better within the walls. Their quarters were crude and overcrowded. Bedding was made of straw soaked with sweat, ale, and whatever else happened during the night. Bathing was rare, and when it did happen, it often took place in communal tubs filled with cold water that was only replaced when absolutely necessary. To make matters worse, their diet consisted of salted meat, hard bread, and weak beer. Constipation was common, and in a world without modern medicine, that was more than just uncomfortable, it could be fatal. Medieval doctors believed the body's humours needed to be balanced, and digestion was part of that equilibrium. Soldiers were advised to eat onions or cabbage to encourage movement, which likely encouraged other things too. In many castles, waste management for the garrisons was barely considered. The focus was on defence, not plumbing. Simple wooden buckets were placed in corners of guard towers and emptied periodically over the wall or into trenches. During the night, when attackers might be lurking outside, soldiers had no choice but to use what was called a night jar. These ceramic containers were the medieval ancestor of the chamber pot, but far less refined. Some were shared among entire patrol groups. You can imagine the camaraderie that built. The sanitation issues didn't end with the toilets themselves. Flies, lice, and rats thrived in these conditions, spreading disease faster than any enemy sword. Fleas carried plague bacteria, and castles were perfect environments for infestation. Warm, crowded, and full of organic material. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, didn't spare the nobility or their soldiers. Even fortified castles couldn't defend against a flea riding on a rat's back. Some historians believe the disease spread through trade routes that supplied castles with grain, meat, and ale, all of which came packed with more life than advertised. The irony of medieval sanitation was that castles were designed to keep people safe, yet they often made their inhabitants sick. The closed environment trapped air, waste, and moisture. During winter, fires burned constantly, but the smoke only mixed with the stench, creating a suffocating haze. Guards stationed in towers sometimes resorted to hanging herbs from the ceiling, or burning dried dung for warmth. Yes, you heard that right. Burning waste as fuel was a common practice. It didn't smell good, but at least it kept the cold out, and by medieval standards, that was considered efficient. You make your way through another narrow passage, this one leading toward the outer wall. Here, the architecture changes. The walls are thinner, the windows smaller. This is where the soldiers lived, ate, and handled the less glamorous aspects of castle life. Archaeological findings from sites like Caerphilly and Bodiam show layers of compacted waste in old latrine shafts, often mixed with animal dung from the horses kept nearby. It was all part of the same system. Waste from stables flowed into the same trenches as human waste, and from there into the moat. When it rained, the entire lower level of the castle smelled like a barnyard explosion. One of the strangest sanitation features of medieval castles was the garderobe block, essentially a row of toilets stacked vertically through multiple floors. Nobles on the upper levels had the best seats, while soldiers and servants below had to deal with the consequences of gravity. Engineers tried to design separate shafts, but corners were often cut. It wasn't uncommon for waste from higher floors to leak through cracks into lower rooms. In one case recorded at Windsor Castle, repairs had to be made after a section of the wall gave way under accumulated matter. The official report didn't specify details, but you can imagine the cleanup. The concept of hygiene among soldiers was more practical than philosophical. A soldier cared less about disease theory, and more about avoiding rashes, infections and vermin. Medieval armies didn't have formal sanitation units, but there were basic rules. Latrine pits had to be dug away from sleeping areas and waste covered with dirt. This worked fine in the open field, but failed spectacularly in castle sieges. During the siege of Rouen in 1418, trapped soldiers resorted to dumping waste directly from battlements into the river below. When the river froze, the results were catastrophic. The entire castle turned into a frozen fortress of filth. To make things worse, some castles had wells built inside their walls to ensure water during sieges. It seemed brilliant until waste seeped into the groundwater. Testing of ancient well sediments shows high nitrate levels and traces of human pathogens, meaning the water was already tainted centuries ago. Drinking it was essentially sipping medieval soup. People added ale or wine to mask the taste, not realizing the alcohol didn't actually kill the bacteria. The result was a cycle of sickness disguised as luxury. You pause beside a narrow slit window overlooking the moat. In the torchlight you can almost see what this would have looked like centuries ago. The soldiers leaning over the wall, armour clanking, trying to aim their waist between arrows of defence. The moat below, dark and glistening, carrying the evidence of daily life along its murky surface. This wasn't just a fortification. It was a living ecosystem powered by human survival and human waste. And yet, for all its flaws, the castle endured. Its walls may have smelled of smoke, sweat, and sewage, but they also represented human ingenuity. People adapted, survived, and built systems that, for all their failings, laid the groundwork for modern sanitation. Every flush today owes something to these crude, gravity-fed shafts and the people who risked their lives to clean them. The torch flickers again, and for a moment the walls seem to breathe. The scent of damp stone and cold air fills your lungs as you step back from the window. Above you, the castle sleeps, a fortress of ambition and odour. You can almost hear the echo of soldiers' boots, the distant splash of the moat, and the faint, eternal murmur of history's least glamorous truth. And as you turn toward the next passageway, you notice something glimmering in the corner of the wall, a small metal grate, leading into another hidden shaft. Not for soldiers this time. This one connects to something grander, more private, and far more secret. The kind of toilet reserved for royalty itself. The grate in the wall gleams faintly in the torchlight. You crouch to look closer, and there it is again, that unmistakable smell of human history at its most humbling. This isn't a soldier's waste shaft or a servant's slop drain. It's something far more elite. The private passage for royal disposal, leading to the king's or queen's personal garderobe. Every stone in this chamber whispers secrets, and none of them are elegant. The monarchs who ruled kingdoms, who commanded armies, and who declared wars with divine confidence, still ended each day right here, alone, cold, and very human. Royal bathrooms were not built for privacy. They were built for ritual. Medieval rulers didn't just sit on their thrones in the Great Hall, they also sat on literal ones. Some of the most powerful monarchs in history had special chairs built for this purpose, carved from oak or stone, fitted with embroidered cushions and sometimes even decorated with jewels. Archaeologists have uncovered surviving examples of these close stools, which were essentially wooden chairs with holes cut into the seat and a chamber pot placed below. It sounds luxurious until you remember that someone else had to empty it, that someone was the groom of the stool. It sounds like a bad joke, but this was one of the most important roles in a royal court. The groom's job was to attend the monarch during their private moments, ensuring everything from cleanliness to comfort. He managed the linens, the pot, the perfumes, and occasionally the conversation. It was a position of deep trust. He was the only person allowed to speak freely to the king at his most vulnerable, and because of that, he wielded enormous influence. Letters from the Tudor period describe the groom of the stool as a man who knew more of the king's secrets than any living soul. Which makes sense. It's hard to hide much from the person holding the bucket. One of the most famous grooms was Sir Henry Norris, who served Henry VIII. He wasn't just a servant, he was a confidant. Norris handled everything from royal correspondence to personal favours. But as with all royal proximity, power came with peril. When Henry accused Anne Boleyn of adultery, Norris was implicated too. The evidence? His closeness to the king's private life. He was executed shortly after. It's an understatement to say his career ended in the line of duty. The royal garderobe itself was often an architectural centrepiece. Some were built into tall towers extending beyond the outer wall, ensuring gravity handled the cleanup. Others were designed with hidden chutes that emptied into private cesspits guarded by stone vaults. Windsor Castle, for example, had multiple garderobes, each one serving a different part of the royal family and court. The higher your rank, the closer your toilet was to the central keep. Proximity to the throne wasn't just political, it was practical. Medieval royalty took their hygiene seriously, at least in theory. Bathing was considered both medical and spiritual, a way to balance the humours and purify the soul. But baths were rare and elaborate. Servants filled giant wooden tubs with hot water carried by hand from the kitchen. The monarch bathed first, followed by favoured courtiers in the same water. Perfumed oils and herbs were added to hide the inevitable cloud of humanity. After bathing, they might use linen cloths dipped in vinegar to freshen up. The vinegar was meant to kill germs, though germ theory was still 500 years away. Mostly it made everyone smell like a salad. Perfume was another royal obsession. The garderobe chamber often included bowls of dried flowers, spices and powdered resins. Lavender, rosemary and clove were common choices. Some nobles even burned incense sticks while seated, which made the rooms smoky enough to resemble a small chapel. But these efforts were more about pretending than preventing. The underlying problem of waste disposal never went away. The smell seeped through the walls no matter how many rose petals were scattered over it. In the cold months, things got even worse. Waste froze in the shafts, causing blockages that backed up into the walls. Royal masons were paid extra during winter to break apart these icy monuments to digestion. One account from the 14th century mentions great trouble caused by the freezing of foul waters within the pipes of Her Majesty's Tower. Translation: the Queen's toilet exploded. You won't find that story in the fairy tales. Yet despite the mess, the garderobe had a strange aura of prestige. Having an indoor toilet was a symbol of status. Nobles showed off their facilities as proudly as they displayed their tapestries. Castles without garderobes relied on chamber pots, which were fine for servants, but undignified for royalty. The upper class saw indoor waste disposal as a mark of civilization, proof that they were closer to God and further from the peasants who relieved themselves in fields. Ironically, those same peasants often lived cleaner lives because their waste composted naturally, while noble cesspits poisoned their wells. There's a peculiar detail often overlooked in history books. The royal garderobe wasn't just a toilet, it was a social space. Monarchs sometimes conducted business from their thrones of privacy. Chroniclers describe ambassadors, advisors, and even clergymen being summoned for discreet conversation, while the monarch attended to bodily matters. The reasoning was simple. If you could handle this, you were loyal. It was an unspoken test of endurance and devotion. Diplomacy met biology in the most literal way imaginable. Royal waste didn't simply vanish after it dropped into the pit. It was collected, analysed, and sometimes even valued. In some palaces, it was customary for the groom of the stool to inspect the contents for signs of illness. Colour, texture, and smell were all noted in records that read like the world's worst medical journal. This practice persisted well into the Renaissance. Doctors believed a ruler's health was reflected in their waste, and royal bowels were treated as matters of state. The health of a nation depended quite literally on what came out of the king. Over time, the role of the groom of the stool evolved. By the 17th century, it became a mark of honour, reserved for high-ranking courtiers. The position came with wealth, influence, and access to the most private corridors of power. Entire political careers were built on proximity to the toilet. It's strange to think about, but in many ways, medieval sanitation shaped the politics of Europe. Power didn't just rest on military strength or divine right, it rested on who held the towel. As you imagine this strange hierarchy of hygiene, you begin to see the castle differently. Every hallway, every tower, every carefully carved stone tells a story of both grandeur and grime. The royal garderobe wasn't an oddity, it was a necessity. It symbolised the constant tension between human weakness and royal illusion. Kings wanted to be gods, but gods don't have bowels. The air feels heavier as you stand again, the torch crackling in your hand. You can almost picture the scene centuries ago. The king seated on his carved stool, the groom waiting patiently nearby, and the faint hum of wind moving through the waste shaft. This was the most private room in the castle, and yet it was also the most human. Every decision, every battle, every law and decree came from a body just as fragile and flawed as any other. You step out into the corridor once more. The torchlight dances across the walls, revealing faded carvings and the faint scent of perfumed ash. Somewhere beyond these walls, servants still scrubbed, scraped, and carried away the byproducts of royal living. You start to wonder what it must have been like for those who cleaned up after the rulers of the world, the forgotten workers who kept the illusion of elegance alive. The torch flickers again, and you follow the corridor downward. The smell changes. Less perfume, more damp air and soot. Ahead lies another world of castle sanitation, one not reserved for kings or knights, but for the invisible class who did the dirtiest job of all. You follow the passage downward into a part of the castle most nobles never saw. The air turns heavier here, the scent of damp limestone mingling with the faint, unmistakable trace of centuries-old waste. This is the servants' world, the underbelly of royal life. Above ground there were banquets and silk. Down here there was sweat, fire, and an endless war against filth. This was where the real work of maintaining a castle's hygiene, or the closest thing to it, actually happened. The people who managed castle sanitation weren't glamorous figures in history books. They were invisible, working mostly at night, buried beneath the hierarchy of servants. Some were known as gong farmers, others as night men, and in certain records simply the diggers. Their job was to empty cesspits, scrape garderobe chutes, and haul barrels of waste beyond the castle walls. They earned decent pay by medieval standards, but at a price few were willing to pay. The smell clung to them permanently. Townspeople often refused to stand near them, and they lived on the outskirts of society. Literally outside the walls they kept clean. There was a practical reason they worked at night. The waste fumes could be deadly. Methane built up in the pits, mixing with the torchlight, creating a perfect recipe for spontaneous explosions. There are recorded cases of entire latrine chambers igniting when a worker's lantern got too close. It's hard to imagine a worse way to go. Killed in a fiery accident while cleaning someone else's royal leftovers, but it happened. In the 14th century, an account from London describes a man burned unto ash in the pit beneath the abbey. The monks called it divine punishment. It was probably just bad ventilation. Cleaning cesspits wasn't just dangerous, it was also scientific in its own twisted way. Workers had to understand the layers of decomposition. Fresh waste at the top, older sediment below, and compacted matter at the bottom known as night soil. This thick tar-like sludge was valuable. It was often collected, dried and sold to farmers as fertilizer. The logic was sound. Human waste was rich in nitrogen and phosphates, excellent for crops. Unfortunately, it was also rich in parasites and disease. So while the gong farmers thought they were helping the harvest, they were quietly spreading infection through the entire countryside. In a sense, medieval agriculture was built on optimism and dysentery. Even within the castle walls, this recycling mentality persisted. Waste wasn't simply thrown away, it was repurposed. Ash from the kitchens was mixed with urine to make lye, an ingredient used in early soap production. Tanners used urine to soften leather, and laundresses used it to bleach linen. The ammonia content made it effective, but you can imagine how the castle laundry room must have smelled. A mixture of boiled clothes, hot urine, and despair. Yet people genuinely believed they were improving cleanliness. In their own way, they were. The smell of ammonia killed some bacteria, even if no one understood why. It was the medieval version of science through suffering, and you can picture the scene. A group of labourers trudging through the castle courtyard at night, carrying buckets sloshing with contents too vile to describe. The torches flicker, casting orange light on their faces. They dump the waste into carts and wheel it to the moat, where it joins the foul soup of runoff, refuse, and the occasional dead rat. The sound of liquid hitting water echoes through the night like a grim lullaby. These were the men who kept the castle from drowning in its own luxury. No one thanked them, no one spoke to them, but without them, the entire fortress would have collapsed under the weight of its own stench. The irony is that these workers, reviled as unclean, probably understood sanitation better than the people they served. They knew the dangers of standing too close to stagnant pits. They knew to cover their faces with cloth soaked in vinegar to reduce the fumes. They even developed primitive safety rituals such as striking flint near a pit to check for methane before lighting a torch. They were chemists without realizing it, engineers without blueprints, and martyrs without recognition. There was also a strange economy built around waste. In medieval cities, the collection of refuse was regulated by local guilds. A gong farmer could make a small fortune selling manure to nearby estates. In London, some even leased cesspits as private enterprises, emptying them on contract. The most infamous example is the 1326 King's Ditch, a massive open sewer running through the heart of Cambridge. Students and locals alike dumped everything into it: waste, offal, carcasses, and by the end of the century the stench was legendary. Eventually the city paid teams of workers to drain it, creating what might be history's first publicly funded sanitation project. Progress, one shovel at a time. Servants within castles faced their own sanitation challenges. Water had to be carried in by hand, bucket after bucket from wells or streams, often uphill through narrow staircases. The same water used for washing was reused for scrubbing floors and rinsing chamber pots. Servants developed a hierarchy of buckets, one for drinking, one for washing, and one for waste. It sounds organised, until you remember that these buckets were wooden, porous, and indistinguishable in low light. Mix-ups were common. There's no delicate way to say it. Sometimes people drank from the wrong one. The filth wasn't limited to the ground level. Chimneys, ovens, and kitchens added their own brand of soot and grime. Combined with waste, this created a layer of residue on every surface. Even the castle's walls absorbed it. When archaeologists clean medieval plaster, they often find microscopic traces of human waste embedded in the paint. Imagine centuries of noble portraits smiling serenely from walls that literally stank of history. Cleanliness wasn't a state of being, it was a distant aspiration. Despite all this, medieval people weren't ignorant. They recognised the importance of air circulation and attempted rudimentary ventilation. Some garderobes were built with vents or chimneys to carry away fumes. Others used draft corridors, narrow openings that allowed the wind to sweep through and dry the waste shafts. It was an imperfect system, but it showed that even then people were experimenting with airflow and pressure, concepts that wouldn't be formalised until the Renaissance. The fact that they achieved any success without scientific theory is almost impressive. You find yourself imagining the smell of those corridors, damp straw, sour air, and a faint hint of herbs from the bundles hung along the walls. Servants placed sprigs of lavender, sage, or thyme in corners to mask the odour. The practice gave rise to the medieval strewing herbs tradition, where fresh plants were scattered on floors for scent and pest control. This custom eventually evolved into the floral decorations seen in later centuries. The medieval obsession with fragrance wasn't vanity, it was survival. Some castles went further. In an effort to improve hygiene, they installed primitive water channels for cleaning the garderobes. Rainwater collected on roofs was diverted through stone troughs to flush waste down the shafts. It wasn't a perfect system. Water pressure was inconsistent and leaks often formed, but it was the foundation of modern plumbing. Evidence from the castles of Bodiam and Dover shows that these channels were integrated into the structure, running like veins through the stone. Medieval builders might not have understood microbiology, but they understood gravity. The more you think about it, the clearer it becomes that castles were living organisms. They breathed, leaked, and decayed. Waste flowed through them like blood through veins. Every layer of the structure, from the high towers to the lowliest pit, was part of the same system. And just as in a body, the smallest failure could be catastrophic. Blocked drains caused rot. Rot weakened walls. Walls collapsed. The destruction of one garderobe tower could compromise an entire fortress. Sanitation wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. The torch crackled softly, and for a moment you can almost hear the ghosts of the workers who toiled here. The clatter of wooden buckets, the hiss of water poured over stone, the quiet grumbling of men who knew they were essential but unseen. History remembers the kings who built castles, but not the ones who kept them from smelling like death. Without these invisible labourers, medieval luxury would have suffocated under its own vanity. You take one last breath of the damp, heavy air. The scent of centuries still lingers, but now it carries something else: respect. The unseen workers, the nightmen, the cleaners of the unclean. They built the foundation for the sanitation systems that define modern life. You climb back toward the light, passing through the winding corridors that once echoed with their footsteps. Above you, the castle still stands proud, a monument to power. But beneath it lies the true story, the story of those who kept it from drowning in its own grandeur. And as you emerge into the open courtyard once again, a thought crosses your mind. If the nobles relied so much on these people to manage their waste, what happened when war broke out and the system collapsed? What did sanitation look like when castles became battlefields and waste became one more enemy to survive? You step back into the courtyard, and the air hits different now. It's colder, sharper, the kind of air that bites at the nose and makes the damp earth smell almost clean. But something is off. The usual hum of castle life, the clang of pots, the chatter of servants, the splash of water from buckets, is missing. The castle feels quieter, heavier. You realise why as you glance at the walls. They're lined with soldiers, not servants. The banners hang still, the gates are sealed, the castle is under siege. When war came, the first thing to vanish wasn't luxury, it was sanitation. Suddenly hundreds of soldiers, servants and nobles were trapped inside with limited water, dwindling supplies, and no way to dispose of waste. What began as a fortress quickly became an enormous chamber pot. Siege warfare wasn't just about starvation. It was about what happened when nature called and no one could answer it properly. Imagine it. Weeks of rain and fear, with every garderobe chute and cesspit overflowing because the waste collectors couldn't go outside. Moats filled with more than just water, the stench clinging to every breath. Disease always followed, creeping through the castle faster than arrows ever could. Dysentery, typhoid and cholera turned proud soldiers into hollow, feverish ghosts. During long sieges, it wasn't uncommon for more people to die from sanitation failure than from battle wounds. There are grim records from the Siege of Rochester in 1215, when the defenders, trapped inside for weeks, ran out of fresh water. They were forced to drink from the moat that doubled as a toilet. Chroniclers noted that the water ran foul with the filth of the castle. You can picture the moment, thirst overcoming reason, men kneeling beside the same moat they'd been dumping into. The smell alone could make a man lose hope. But thirst has no mercy, and desperation makes hygiene optional. The soldiers who defended castles faced the same bodily realities as anyone else, but their toilets were designed for function, not comfort. Many used wooden benches built into the walls along parapets or towers, with openings that dropped straight into the moat or down the exterior face of the castle. During peace, it was crude but efficient. During war, it was dangerous. Exposing yourself over a castle wall while archers fired from below was not ideal. Some defenders installed slanted stone channels instead, allowing them to relieve themselves from relative safety. It wasn't glamorous, but it was survival. The problem of sanitation during sieges became so severe that it influenced castle design. Later medieval architects began incorporating internal waste shafts and hidden drainage passages that could be accessed from within the keep. These systems allowed limited use even during attacks, though they were still primitive. Waste often built up in the walls, leading to cracks, blockages, and a very different kind of siege from the inside out. Archaeological digs at Chateau Gaillard in France revealed one of the strangest sanitation failures in medieval history. During a siege in 1204, attackers managed to infiltrate the castle not through the gates or towers, but through the latrine shafts. The defenders never thought anyone would crawl up through a hole designed for waste. But human desperation makes for creative warfare. Soldiers climbed through the garderobe openings and into the heart of the fortress. The castle fell within days. In the end, it wasn't the sword or the battering ram that breached the walls, it was plumbing. There's a dark humour in that. The same structures meant to keep filth out ended up letting enemies in. Castles were brilliant fortresses, but their waste systems were their Achilles heel. Engineers knew this, and in later centuries some castles built false garderobe shafts as traps. Imagine the horror of climbing through one, expecting victory, only to land in a pit filled with centuries of refuse. It's poetic, in a very unpleasant way. The soldiers inside still had to live through it, and for them, disease was a greater enemy than the besiegers outside. Medical understanding at the time was primitive. They blamed the bad air for sickness, not realizing that the true culprit was festering inside the very walls. Filth seeped into water supplies, and with every bucket drawn from a contaminated cistern, more fell ill. Chroniclers described entire garrisons reduced to shivering men clutching their stomachs while trying to keep watch on the battlements. The sound of moaning sometimes replaced the sound of war drums. In desperation, some commanders ordered the garderobe sealed to prevent enemies from using them as entry points. That only made things worse. Buckets filled faster, waste piled higher, and soon the castle became its own trap. At the 1296 siege of Dunbar Castle in Scotland, defenders reportedly threw waste buckets directly at attackers when supplies ran out of stones. It worked, briefly, but the stench clung to the walls for weeks after. Every gust of wind carried the reminder of their last defence. Siege toilets weren't just improvised. They were improvised badly. Soldiers dug shallow pits in corners of courtyards and covered them with planks. The smell attracted flies, which spread infection. When rain came, the pits flooded, mixing with mud and blood until no one could tell where one began and the other ended. The ground itself became an enemy. Modern excavations of siege layers in castles like Harlech and Beeston have found compacted soil rich in human waste, confirming just how overwhelming the problem was. And yet, soldiers endured. They had to. Discipline meant survival, and even in these dire conditions there were attempts at order. Medieval commanders issued sanitation rules similar to modern military protocols. Waste was to be buried when possible, kept away from food stores, and never disposed of near wells. Of course, in a siege, those orders were more hopeful than realistic, but they show that even in the darkest moments, people were learning. Outside the castle walls, attackers faced similar horrors. They camped for weeks or months, digging their own latrines in the mud, often too close to sleeping areas. The mixture of human waste, rainwater, and animal carcasses created perfect breeding grounds for disease. The same bacteria that killed defenders also swept through the besiegers. In some cases, entire armies had to retreat not because of defeat, but because they were too sick to continue. The smell of siege warfare was unlike anything else. Chroniclers tried to describe it, but even they struggled. One French account from 1347 described a castle that reeked as if 1,000 beasts had died within its belly. Another chronicler, writing about the siege of Carcassonne, said the stench was so vile it turned the stomach of God himself. Hyperbole, perhaps, but the truth wasn't far off. For the people living through it, survival meant ignoring the smell, the sickness, and the filth, one day at a time. What's most fascinating is how sanitation during sieges foreshadowed the principles of modern urban planning. Medieval commanders began to understand that waste management was as vital as walls and weapons. After enough soldiers died from bad water, people started to pay attention. Wells were built deeper, latrine shafts reinforced, and castles expanded their drainage systems. The lesson was simple but brutal. Control your waste, or it will control you. You can almost picture it now. The flicker of torches along the ramparts, the groan of men too weak to fight, the slow trickle of foul water through the cracks in the stone. Siege warfare wasn't just a battle of armies. It was a battle against biology, a slow war between the human body and its own limits. As the dawn creeps over the castle walls, the siege ends. The attackers retreat, the survivors stagger into the courtyard, and the silence that follows is almost worse than the noise. Everywhere you look, the remnants of life remain. Broken buckets, frozen pits, the ghosts of 100 unglamorous deaths. The castle stands, but it smells like defeat. You take one last look at the stained stones, the moat dark with memory, and realise that this is what medieval heroism really looked like. It wasn't knights in shining armour or grand speeches. It was men with shovels trying to keep a fortress from drowning in itself. And as you move toward the inner keep once again, the torchlight flickers against the wall, revealing something carved just above a narrow door, a faint inscription in Latin. You can barely read it, but it translates roughly to this: "Cleanliness is the breath of life." A beautiful sentiment in a place that never smelled clean. It makes you wonder, what happened to all that waste once peace returned? Where did it go when the castle needed to look royal again? The words carved into the stone linger in your mind as you step through the narrow door. The air grows warmer again, thick with smoke from nearby hearths. The siege is over, the castle is quiet, and for the first time in weeks people can breathe without tasting the moat. But peace doesn't mean cleanliness. The end of a siege only begins the next nightmare, the clean-up. When the gates reopened, the first order of business wasn't celebration, it was sanitation. The filth left behind after a siege was unimaginable. Every corner of the castle was caked in grime, waste pits overflowed, water barrels were fouled, and the air hung heavy with disease. Servants and labourers began what might be the least romantic job in all of medieval history, restoring the castle to something resembling livable. And it started with shovels. The cesspits beneath the walls had to be emptied first. These were often deep stone-lined chambers that had been collecting waste for months. Teams of gong farmers were brought in from nearby towns, hauling barrels and scraping the sludge from walls with iron tools. Records from the 14th century England show that nobles paid handsomely for this service. One account from 1375 notes that a group of workers were paid 2 shillings a night to cleanse the pit of filth and restore sweet air to the Lord's chamber. You can't help but wonder if sweet air was ever really achieved. Once the pits were cleared, the waste was carted away, often to nearby fields or riverbanks. There it was spread and left to dry, turning what had once been a biohazard into what farmers called night soil. It was used to fertilise crops which, in an ironic twist, would later feed the very people who produced it. In a world without chemical fertilisers, the human body was part of the agricultural cycle. You ate the grain, you digested the grain, and the grain came back to you one way or another. It was a closed loop powered by questionable optimism. But the problems went deeper, literally. Waste had seeped into the mortar of castle walls, staining the stone and filling cracks with bacteria. Even centuries later, archaeologists find evidence of this. Chemical analysis of castle masonry has revealed high nitrate levels in certain areas, especially near garderobes. In some cases, builders tried to mask the damage by plastering over the walls or burning herbs to disguise the smell. At Windsor Castle, records show entire chambers were abandoned because the odour was too great for human dwelling. You know it's bad when the medieval solution is just brick it up. Then there was the issue of water. Wells and cisterns had been contaminated during the siege, and clean water had to be hauled in from outside. Servants boiled it with vinegar or wine, believing this would purify it. The idea wasn't entirely wrong. Vinegar can kill some bacteria, but it couldn't undo the months of filth that had soaked into every corner of the fortress. Even the kitchens had become laboratories of infection. The same hands that carried buckets of waste also kneaded dough and cleaned utensils. And since soap was a luxury, clean was mostly a matter of perspective. Despite the stench, medieval people genuinely believed they were improving conditions. They sprinkled rushes mixed with herbs across floors, changed them a few times a year, and hung dried flowers from ceilings. Lavender, thyme, and rosemary were popular choices. These weren't just for aesthetics. People thought pleasant smells could push away disease. The miasma theory of the time held that illness came from foul air, so the goal wasn't to eliminate waste, it was to overpower its smell. In a sense, medieval castles were giant air fresheners built over cesspits. The nobles themselves rarely took part in any of this cleanup. They moved between residences constantly, a habit historians now recognise as early pest control. When the smell became unbearable or disease spread, they simply relocated. This habit of rotation kept them ahead of the worst sanitation problems. The servants left behind handled the aftermath, scrubbing, patching, and occasionally burning everything flammable. Fire was one of the few reliable ways to reset a building. Some castles even scheduled regular cleansing fires. Controlled burns meant to sterilise rooms and chase away fleas. Imagine airing out your house by setting it partially on fire. As for the soldiers, their situation improved only slightly. Once the fighting stopped, many were put to work repairing the castle. Their first task was digging. Trenches had to be refilled, waste channels cleared, and moats dredged of the unholy mixture that had accumulated during the siege. The smell of victory was, quite literally, unbearable. Chroniclers noted that some soldiers fainted while cleaning moats, and others refused to work near them at all. They weren't exaggerating. Layers of decomposing matter mixed with animal carcasses produced hydrogen sulfide, a gas that could knock a man unconscious in seconds. More than one castle worker never came back up. This cycle of filth and repair wasn't unique to Europe. Across the world, civilizations faced the same battle between architecture and anatomy. In Japan, samurai households had their own waste collection systems, where servants gathered refuse for farmers who used it as fertilizer. In the Islamic world, public bathhouses and latrines were far more advanced, with flowing water and designated drainage. Compared to them, European castles were experiments in controlled chaos. The wealthiest rulers on the continent were still using systems that made Roman engineers from 1,000 years earlier look like visionaries. And yet the medieval mind saw dignity in these efforts. To them, cleaning was spiritual as much as physical. Monks recorded elaborate rituals for washing floors, lighting incense, and reciting prayers to purify rooms. Some abbeys kept dedicated latrine monks, men assigned to maintain cleanliness in silence as an act of humility. In their view, even the foulest task was holy if done in service to God. It's hard not to admire that kind of dedication, though it's easier to admire it from a safe distance. Once the castle was scrubbed, patched and fumigated, the cycle began again. Fresh rushes on the floor, perfumed cloths on the beds, new tapestries on the walls. The illusion of grandeur was restored. Visitors arriving months later would never guess what horrors had unfolded beneath their feet. They'd marvel at the paintings, the stained glass, the shimmering chandeliers, never realizing that behind the walls The pipes and chutes were already starting to fill again. You stand in the great hall, imagining the layers of history under the floor. The stone slabs gleam, but beneath them lies the residue of generations. Every feast, every celebration, every royal birth or death left its mark. The castle is not just stone and mortar. It's a living organism that has absorbed centuries of waste, sweat, and effort. A place where opulence and decay coexist in perfect medieval balance. Outside, the sky darkens over the castle grounds. The smell of smoke from the kitchens mingles with the earthy scent of freshly turned soil. Somewhere beyond the walls, peasants are spreading the waste from the cesspits across their fields, grateful for the nutrients it provides. The circle continues, unbroken and undeniable. The waste of the powerful feeding the survival of the poor. History, in all its glory and grime, working exactly as intended. You take one last breath of the heavy smoky air and glance toward a narrow staircase leading upward. The scent of herbs and incense grows stronger as you climb, a sure sign you're approaching noble quarters again. The servants have done their job well, but the higher you go, the stranger the smells become. Less earthy, more chemical, almost medicinal. The royal physicians have their own ideas about hygiene, and their methods are about to take things to an entirely new level of absurdity. The staircase spirals upward until you reach a narrow landing that smells faintly of rosemary and old wine. The scent isn't pleasant exactly, but it's certainly trying to be. Here, in the upper chambers, you've entered the world of medieval medicine, the strange intersection of health, hygiene, and misplaced confidence. If the castle's garderobes and cesspits were monuments to necessity, this floor is dedicated to delusion. And nowhere was that more apparent than in the way medieval physicians thought about the human body's most basic function. For nobles, the act of relieving oneself wasn't just biology, it was diagnosis. Medieval doctors believed that every bodily fluid told a story. Urine, bile, and excrement were viewed as reflections of the soul's balance, a concept tied to the ancient theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were sluggish, melancholic, or just unpleasant to be around, a doctor would blame your humours and immediately want to inspect your waste. Yes, even royal physicians made their diagnoses by examining the king's bowel movements. Medicine, in medieval terms, was equal parts theology, astrology, and enthusiastic guessing. One of the most common tools of the trade was the urinal flask. These glass vessels, shaped like elongated bulbs, were used to collect samples of urine, which doctors then studied by holding them up to the light. The colour, clarity, and even smell determined your fate. Too pale and you were cold and weak. Too dark and you were overheated with bile. If it smelled sour, you were infected. If it smelled sweet, congratulations, you were dying. The same logic applied to other bodily outputs, which were sometimes analysed by texture and consistency. There were entire manuals written about what stool colour said about one's moral and physical health. It's safe to say medieval physicians would have been insufferable on modern health forums. This fascination with bodily waste wasn't random. It came from centuries of medical tradition stretching back to ancient Greece. Hippocrates and Galen, the giants of classical medicine, believed that health depended on balance. The idea stuck, and by the Middle Ages it became gospel. Nobles paid enormous sums to have their waste examined regularly. A king's stool could dictate political decisions. If his digestion was poor, he might postpone meetings or wars. The physician's chamber, located near the royal garderobe, was where such analyses took place. The king would sit, perform his duty, and the doctor would make notes. It's an image of power and humility colliding in one room. Sometimes the results of these examinations led to drastic treatments. Laxatives were popular, though the ingredients were nightmarish. Physicians prescribed mixtures of honey, vinegar, crushed herbs, and powdered metals. Mercury, lead, and antimony all made appearances in medical recipes, often causing more harm than the original problem. When constipation persisted, doctors recommended enemas, but not just any enemas, royal ones. Heated water infused with rose oil or wine was poured into the patient through a syringe carved from ivory or brass. The procedure was so common that some nobles had personal enema sets, complete with decorative cases. Having a golden enema syringe was a mark of refinement. It wasn't only the doctors who took an interest in digestion. The court astrologers got involved too. They claimed the alignment of planets influenced when it was safe to purge or relieve oneself. Mercury governed the bowels, Mars ruled bile, and Saturn controlled melancholy, which was, frankly, everyone in the 14th century. Noble diaries contain entries noting auspicious days for bodily cleansing. If your horoscope said to avoid defecation under a waning moon, you waited. The line between medicine and mysticism was a blur that smelled faintly of incense and poor decisions. Hygiene rituals also had a moral component. The church viewed the body as a vessel for sin, and excretion was both a necessity and a reminder of imperfection. Monks were instructed to confess if they found themselves overly preoccupied with cleanliness, as vanity was a dangerous temptation. Yet the same monasteries that preached humility built some of the best sanitation systems in Europe. Cistercian abbeys, for example, had running water in their latrines and separate drainage channels for waste. Monks bathed more often than nobles, and their toilets were communal, but surprisingly efficient. The contradiction was classic medieval logic. Purity through discipline, not comfort. You can almost imagine the scene inside a royal physician's chamber. The air thick with herbs, sage, thyme and wormwood, burning slowly on a brazier to mask the less pleasant aromas. Shelves lined with flasks of coloured liquid, bundles of dried plants, and a scattering of animal bones used in charms. The physician leans over a table, quill in hand, sketching the shape of the king's last stool like an artist studying a landscape. Behind him, a servant holds a towel, another carries a silver bowl, and somewhere in the background, a cleric quietly prays for everyone involved. And this wasn't just eccentricity, there was genuine observation happening here, even if it was framed by superstition. Physicians noticed connections between diet, waste, and illness. They advised against spoiled meat, excessive ale, or sleeping too long after eating. Some even recognised early signs of diseases like jaundice or liver failure based on excretions. It was crude science, but it laid groundwork for modern diagnostics. Every theory, no matter how absurd, started with someone brave enough to look closely at something no one else wanted to. Royal diets made this analysis even more challenging. Nobles consumed mountains of red meat, rich pastries, and wine that could double as vinegar. Fruits and vegetables were considered peasant food, fit only for those who couldn't afford better. The result was chronic constipation on a societal scale. There are letters from royal kitchens requesting shipments of digestive tonics and laxative preserves. These were candied herbs or syrups designed to encourage movement. Imagine ordering prunes by royal decree. When medicine failed, people turned to superstition. Amulets made from dried toads, snake skins, or bezoar stones were worn to protect against stomach ailments. Others swore by holy water of the bowel, blessed by priests for the specific purpose of curing digestive imbalance. Some nobles even built private chapels next to their garderobes, reasoning that prayer and plumbing should be closely linked. It's not exactly faith healing, but it's close. Despite their strange methods, medieval physicians gradually improved their understanding of sanitation. They recognized that foul air from waste pits caused sickness, even if they didn't yet know about microbes. This led to architectural innovations like vented garderobes and enclosed cesspits. The idea of separating living spaces from waste was revolutionary at the time. By the late 15th century, some castles even had rudimentary flushing mechanisms using rainwater. It wasn't modern plumbing, but it was evolution in motion, born from centuries of trial, error, and explosive side effects. As you move through the chamber, the flicker of torchlight glints off glass jars filled with murky liquids. They shimmer like ancient alchemy, a reminder of how deeply medieval people tried to make sense of their own biology. To them, nothing about the body was random. Every ache, every odour, every bowel movement was divine communication, unpleasant but sacred. The modern world might laugh at their methods, but in their own messy way they were searching for truth. You step back toward the corridor, leaving behind the physician's domain and its strange aromas. The air outside feels lighter, though still tinged with smoke and herbs. Somewhere nearby, a faint bubbling sound echoes through the floor. You follow it down a side passage toward a small room with stone basins and steaming water. The castle bathhouse. A place where nobility believed they could wash away impurity, renew health, and smell like someone who didn't live above a sewer. They were wrong, of course, but it's worth seeing how close they came. Steam curls around you as you step into the castle's bathhouse, a rare and deceptively luxurious space in the medieval world. The air feels humid and heavy, carrying the scent of wood smoke, herbs, and something faintly metallic. A copper basin sits in the corner, half full of water that glows orange in the firelight. For a moment you might think you've entered a sanctuary of cleanliness, a reprieve from the castle's endless parade of odours. But look closer, and you realise the truth. This wasn't hygiene as you know it. This was the medieval version of self-care, and it had just as much to do with sewage as it did with soap. Bathing in a castle wasn't an everyday activity. It was a rare, orchestrated event, equal parts ritual, recreation, and medical experiment. For nobles, washing themselves was a statement of wealth. Water had to be heated over open flames and carried by hand through corridors of stone. Servants filled large wooden tubs lined with linen to prevent splinters, then added herbs like chamomile, mint, or marjoram to scent the water. It all looked impressive, but the hygiene benefits were questionable. The same water was reused for everyone, starting with the lord and lady, followed by family, guests, and finally the servants. By the end, the water resembled weak stew. What made matters worse was the belief that bathing too often was dangerous. Physicians warned that hot water opened the pores, letting in bad air and disease. According to the medical wisdom of the 14th century, washing could literally make you sick. So most people bathed sparingly, if at all. A monthly soak was considered diligent. Some nobles prided themselves on bathing once a year, usually at Easter. In between, they relied on perfumes, powders, and clean linen to maintain appearances. The body might not be clean, but the clothing could pretend otherwise. Castles didn't have plumbing in the modern sense, but they did have primitive drainage systems. Bath water was dumped through chutes that led to the same cesspits used by the garderobes. It meant that every relaxing soak was one bucket away from returning to the moat as wastewater. The smell rising from those drains must have been impressive. In winter, when the pipes froze, servants sometimes had to empty tubs by hand. It took up to 10 men to lift and carry the water out, sloshing it down staircases in a trail of steam and slippery chaos. Despite these challenges, bathing had deep social significance. In the 13th century, Queen Eleanor of Provence, wife of Henry III, was said to bathe surrounded by music, silk curtains, and burning incense. Her attendants sponged her skin with scented oils while reading scripture aloud. It was less hygiene and more theatre. The bath was a symbol of moral purity and divine favour. The irony, of course, was that the same water used to symbolise spiritual cleansing was probably hosting enough bacteria to start a small rebellion. Even the soldiers stationed in castles occasionally bathed, though not for comfort. Bathing was considered part of medical treatment. A wounded or feverish knight might be placed in a heated bath infused with herbs to balance his humours. The practice came from Roman tradition, but without understanding of sanitation, it was risky. If the wound didn't kill you, the bathwater might. Bacteria thrived in warm, stagnant water, and the castle's lack of fresh supply ensured contamination spread fast. It's a miracle anyone survived at all. Soap did exist, though it wasn't the pleasant lavender-scented bar you might imagine. Early soap was made from animal fat mixed with lye, a caustic substance derived from wood ash and urine. The result was an abrasive, pungent paste that stripped oils from the skin. Some nobles preferred to wash with flour or crushed herbs instead, leaving their skins soft but their hygiene debatable. The poor, when they could find soap, used it sparingly. It was expensive and often imported. For most people, cleanliness came from scraping, not scrubbing. The bathhouse itself was usually near the kitchen or laundry, where heat and water were plentiful. Steam from boiling pots mixed with smoke from the hearth, creating a fog thick enough to hide in. Servants carried torches to light the space, their reflections flickering across the water's surface. The floor was covered in straw to absorb spills, which only worked for a day or two before it became its own ecosystem. Mould crept up the walls, and insects took refuge in the damp crevices of the stone. But in a world where daily smells included open cesspits, spoiled meat, and wet hay, this was still paradise. Interestingly, medieval people didn't associate smell with dirtiness the way we do now. A strong aroma was just part of life, and certain scents even indicated vitality. The word stench wasn't inherently negative. Doctors prescribed odour baths using vinegar or wine vapours to strengthen the lungs. People believed that inhaling strong smells could cleanse the body. It's the kind of logic that only makes sense when your other options involve fermented waste pits. Bathing wasn't just private either. Communal baths, or stews, as they were called, were popular in medieval towns. These were part bathhouse, part social club, and part health hazard. Men and women bathed together in large wooden tubs, often with food and wine served on floating trays. Some even played music or dice games while soaking. By the late Middle Ages, these public baths had gained a scandalous reputation, becoming centres for prostitution. The church condemned them, citing moral decay and the spread of disease. By the 16th century, many were shut down, replaced by the more discreet filth of personal neglect. Within castle walls, though, the bath remained a private privilege. Nobles clung to the idea of purification, both physical and spiritual. They added exotic ingredients to their baths: milk, honey, and occasionally crushed gems, which they believed strengthened the body's vital essence. There's an account of a Hungarian queen bathing in wine for its supposed rejuvenating powers. She likely came out sticky, broke, and no cleaner than before, but the symbolism was everything. Servants who maintained the baths had the unenviable job of cleaning up afterward. They drained the water, scraped the tub, and removed the soggy rushes from the floor. If the lord was particularly indulgent, oils and herbs made the residue nearly impossible to clean. The leftover water, now an oily stew of perfume and filth, was dumped into the same trenches that carried kitchen refuse. Every bath contributed to the castle's unique aroma, a blend of luxury, decay, and effort. One might expect the royal physicians to encourage cleanliness, but their advice was often contradictory. Some recommended bathing only during specific moon phases. Others warned that washing after eating could cause weakness of the heart. There were even cases of nobles who avoided water entirely, preferring to be cleaned with linen cloths dusted in powder. By the Renaissance, stories circulated about kings who prided themselves on not bathing for decades. Henry IV of France allegedly took only 3 baths in his lifetime. His courtiers described him as charming, brilliant, and impossible to stand near. You can see why perfume became such a crucial part of medieval life. Nobles stored dried herbs in their sleeves, pressed flowers into their hats, and carried pomanders filled with cloves and ambergris. Rooms were fumigated with scented smoke. Some garderobes were even fitted with vents designed to hold burning incense. The medieval answer to sanitation was to make everything smell slightly better, or at least slightly different. It didn't solve the problem, but it made pretending easier. The water in the bath before you ripples gently, reflecting the firelight like molten glass. You can almost imagine a noblewoman stepping in, sighing with relief, unaware that her bath water came from the same cistern feeding the kitchen and the garderobe. The illusion of cleanliness was enough. In a world where waste, disease, and death were constant companions, Pretending to be pure was an act of defiance. As you leave the bathhouse, the steam fades behind you, replaced once again by the chill of the stone corridors. The air grows drier, and the faint echo of your footsteps mixes with another sound, the rustle of cloth, the click of wooden shoes, the creak of leather belts. You've entered the laundry wing, where the servants wage their own endless war against the stains of medieval life. Here, cleanliness was earned through labour, not luxury. And every bucket of water carried into this room came from the same source as everything else in the castle. The air in the laundry wing is warmer than the rest of the castle. The scent of wood smoke and damp cloth fills the space, mingling with something sharper, like vinegar and sweat. It's not unpleasant exactly, but it's heavy, thick with the smell of labour. This is where the illusion of cleanliness begins, not with perfume or baths, but with boiling water and blistered hands. Here, in the castle's washhouse, servants fought the impossible battle against filth, and the enemy was everywhere. Laundry in the Middle Ages wasn't a daily task, it was a campaign. Most garments were worn repeatedly for weeks or even months before they were washed. Fine linen shirts and undergarments, those precious few layers that touched the skin, absorbed sweat, oil, and everything else that came with medieval living. When they could no longer be ignored, they were hauled here for purification. The process took days. Buckets of water were fetched from the well, heated in massive cauldrons, and mixed with a pungent blend of soap, ash, and lye. The resulting brew was powerful enough to strip fabric, flesh, and dignity in equal measure. Soap, in its earliest form, was an accidental invention. It came from mixing animal fat with ash, a combination discovered when ancient cooks noticed that rainwater dripping through campfire remains produced a cleaning effect. By the time castles rose across Europe, soap making was a specialised craft. Tallow from sheep and oxen was rendered down and combined with alkaline lye made from soaked wood ash. The smell was horrendous. Workers in medieval soap factories were known to be among the least popular people in town, rivaled only by the tanners who soaked hides in urine. Yet despite its stench, soap was a treasure. For nobles, owning soap was like owning bottled modern luxury. Laundry wasn't done for comfort, it was survival. Dirty linen attracted lice and fleas, carriers of typhus and plague. Castle servants, often covered in bites, would strip bedding, dunk it into boiling vats, and beat it with paddles until their arms went numb. It wasn't romantic work. The water splashed and hissed, filling the room with steam so dense it turned the air into a sauna of suffering. The goal was simple: make the sheets smell less like a person and more like a forest fire. The water itself came from the same sources that fed the garderobes and kitchen. Wells were rarely deep enough to avoid contamination. By the time it reached the laundry, it carried hints of mineral, mud, and mystery. Servants tried to purify it with herbs or vinegar, but that was wishful thinking. In some castles, rainwater was collected from rooftops and stored in barrels for washing. It was cleaner, but not by much. Birds had a tendency to contribute their own ingredients to the process. The final rinse, when it happened, was less a cleansing act and more a polite gesture toward decency. The irony is that cleanliness was considered a mark of nobility, yet it depended entirely on the labour of people who were never clean themselves. The laundresses of medieval castles were among the hardest working yet least acknowledged workers in the household. They handled clothing, bedding, table linens, and occasionally the aftermath of medical procedures. Their work was physically exhausting and socially invisible. Chroniclers wrote at length about feasts, battles, and royal garments, but never about the people who kept those garments from walking away on their own. To bleach white fabric, they used a technique both clever and revolting. After washing, linens were soaked in a mixture of lye and stale urine. The ammonia in urine acted as a natural bleach, breaking down organic stains and whitening the cloth. Buckets of the stuff were collected throughout the castle, stored in corners and used daily. In some towns, people sold their urine to laundresses, who paid by the jug. The practice was so common that the Romans had taxed urine centuries earlier. It was a strange economy of necessity. When water was scarce and soap expensive, urine was a reliable, renewable resource. You could say the castle's hygiene system was a cycle of waste in, waste out. After bleaching, fabrics were laid out in the courtyard to dry. The sight must have been bizarre. Rows of pristine white linen hanging between walls that had never known true cleanliness. The wind carried the smell of smoke, manure and yeast, blending with the sharp tang of ammonia. Servants moved between the lines, shaking and folding cloth that weighed more than armour when wet. Every piece represented a day's labour, and yet, within a week, it would return to them for washing again. Noble garments were even more complicated. Silk and velvet couldn't be boiled, so they were cleaned using dry methods. Cloth was brushed, beaten, or rubbed with breadcrumbs and ground chalk to absorb grease. Perfume was then added to disguise whatever lingered. Wealthy lords sometimes had entire trunks of spare clothing just to avoid dealing with the washing process. Instead of cleaning garments, they replaced them. It wasn't laziness, it was practicality. When every cleaning cycle risked destroying fabric worth more than a peasant's yearly wages, buying new seemed reasonable. The castle's laundry routines were also social. Servants gathered in groups singing to keep rhythm while scrubbing and wringing. Their songs weren't just for morale, they helped coordinate movement when several people worked on the same cloth. Imagine a medieval factory floor without machines, powered entirely by song, muscle and mild despair. Archaeological evidence from castle sites even shows the existence of stone troughs, with carved drainage channels suggesting communal washing spaces designed to handle large loads. These were the medieval equivalent of industrial laundromats, except they smelled like scorched fat and vinegar. What's remarkable is how this dirty work shaped the architecture itself. Castles had to accommodate laundry, often dedicating entire wings to it. Windows were small, but positioned to let in enough light and airflow to dry fabrics. Chimneys from the nearby kitchens helped warm the space, creating a steady draft. Drainage holes in the floors let used water escape, though where it went afterward is best not considered. Many of those drains fed into the same cesspits used by garderobes. Clean sheets in the morning, waste beneath by night. The castle was a closed system of hygiene that relied on ignorance for peace of mind. Over time, as fabrics became finer and dyes more expensive, laundry evolved into a status symbol. The whiter your linens, the higher your social standing. Peasants wore rough brown wool, but nobles paraded in glowing linen that screamed wealth. In portraits, white collars and cuffs became symbols of purity, though keeping them white required an army of servants and enough ammonia to dissolve a horse. Clean linen wasn't just about looking good, it was proof that you could afford to be clean. You can almost hear the sounds of the washhouse now, the crackle of fire under the cauldrons, the slap of wet cloth against stone, the hum of voices filling the thick, steamy air. It's a rhythm of survival. Every bucket, every piece of cloth, every burned hand keeps the illusion of civilization intact. Above, the nobles sleep soundly on sheets that no longer reek of last month's feast, unaware of the cost of that comfort. The steam thickens around you, glowing in the torchlight. The water in the vats bubbles softly, sending ripples through the air that make it shimmer like heat on summer stone. Beyond the laundry, through a narrow doorway, you glimpse another part of the castle where water reigns supreme. Stone pipes, narrow channels, and dripping troughs run beneath the floor like veins. The heart of the castle's water system lies there, the cisterns, reservoirs, and wells that fed both life and filth. You move toward the sound of dripping water, ready to see how the same element that promised purity also became the castle's greatest source of disease. The corridor narrows as you follow the sound of dripping water, each echo bouncing off the stone until it feels like the castle itself is breathing. The air here is cool and wet, the scent of moss and limestone seeping into everything. You're standing above the castle's hidden arteries, the water system that kept it alive. Every drop carried through these walls had a story, and most of them didn't end well. In the medieval world, water was both salvation and sabotage, the line between life and disease, and nowhere did that line blur more dangerously than inside the walls of a noble's home. Water wasn't piped in the way it is today. It had to be gathered, carried or channeled from nearby sources. Some castles were lucky enough to be built near natural springs, which made plumbing a little less terrifying. Wells were dug deep into the earth, lined with stone, and covered with wooden hatches to keep out debris, or at least the larger kinds. In theory, these wells supplied clean, fresh water for drinking, cooking and bathing. In practice, they were microbial soup. Waste from garderobes, kitchens and stables seeped through the soil and into the groundwater. The castle's own walls were contaminating its wells. Archaeological studies of medieval fortresses have revealed staggering nitrate levels in ancient wells. Some samples are so polluted that they would classify as hazardous waste today. It's not just dirt that made its way down there. Fecal bacteria, parasites and animal remains all blended together. Yet, medieval people drank this water daily. To make it palatable, they boiled it, or thought they did. Boiling was often half-hearted because firewood was precious. Many preferred to mix the water with ale or wine, which dulled the flavour but did nothing for the bacteria. The result was a never-ending cycle of digestive misery. Castles that didn't have wells relied on rainwater. Builders designed intricate systems of gutters and channels carved into rooftops that directed rainfall into large underground cisterns. It sounds ingenious until you realise those rooftops were covered in soot, bird droppings, and the occasional dead pigeon. Rainwater, pure as it seemed when falling, became contaminated the moment it hit the tiles. And since cisterns were often placed near garderobes for convenience, the same stone that stored drinking water also absorbed the castle's less dignified contributions. It's safe to say the fresh rainwater often tasted suspiciously familiar. The design of medieval plumbing was a masterpiece of limited understanding. Waste and water systems were often intertwined because engineers didn't distinguish between in and out. Stone conduits that carried fresh water sometimes shared walls, or cracks, with drains that carried waste away. In many castles, waste chutes ran alongside kitchen pipes, and the only thing separating them was optimism. The castle at Caernarfon, for example, had a beautiful water channel that ran under the kitchen floor. It looked brilliant on paper, until waste runoff from a nearby garderobe joined the same route. The result was an indoor moat of bacterial ambition. For the soldiers stationed inside, bad water was more than inconvenient. It was deadly. Chronic diarrhea, dysentery and stomach cramps were common complaints. In some garrisons, soldiers carried flasks of weak ale rather than water, because alcohol was considered healthier. It wasn't, but at least it dulled the awareness of what they were drinking. Chronic dehydration was another problem. Many soldiers spent long shifts in armour, sweating under the heat of the sun or the fires of the kitchen. With water scarce and questionable, some resorted to drinking broth made from whatever was available, including old meat or bone scraps. It kept them alive, but only barely. Even the nobility suffered from the same unseen filth. There are records of royal courts plagued by outbreaks of summer flux, a polite term for uncontrollable diarrhea. The culprit was almost always bad water. Medieval medicine blamed it on celestial imbalance or heat of the liver, but the truth lay in the walls themselves. The very castles designed to display power were quietly poisoning their owners. The royal physicians prescribed rosewater, vinegar drinks and herbal tonics, none of which solved the problem but made the suffering smell slightly nicer. Some attempts at innovation did exist. In larger castles, lead pipes were installed to carry water from cisterns to kitchens and baths. Lead was considered an advanced material because it was flexible and durable. No one realised it was also toxic. Chronic lead poisoning in the nobility might explain certain historical mysteries, strange bouts of madness, sudden deaths, and royal temper tantrums that lasted weeks. Historians studying hair samples from medieval remains have found elevated lead levels in nearly every case. In a sense, medieval luxury came with built-in consequences. The relationship between waste and water was so precarious that every rainfall posed a risk. Heavy storms flooded cesspits and moats, carrying waste into living areas. Servants scrambled to shovel mud and filth out of hallways, while nobles retreated to upper chambers and burned incense in self-defence. The castle became a vertical society divided by sanitation. The higher you lived, the safer you were from the mess below, at least until the smell reached you anyway. And then there was the moat. The romantic image of shimmering water surrounding a fortress hides a darker truth. Many moats doubled as waste dumps, receiving everything from animal carcasses to human refuse. During dry seasons, stagnant moats became breeding grounds for disease. When the wind shifted, the odour blanketed the entire courtyard. Yet, people still used the moat water for washing dishes or watering gardens. It was the medieval version of recycling, though not the kind you'd want near your food. The castle kitchen too relied on these same tainted sources. Water used for cooking came directly from wells or cisterns. Boiling helped a little, but pots were rarely scrubbed clean. The build-up of residue created a microbial film that thrived in warm, wet environments. Bread was dipped in this water, meat was boiled in it, and utensils were rinsed in it. The average medieval dinner was an experiment in immunity, and somehow enough people survived to build the Renaissance. One of the few places that handled water correctly was the monastery. Monks, unlike most nobles, valued cleanliness as spiritual discipline. Many monasteries had sophisticated plumbing, including channels that carried fresh water for washing and separate drains for waste. The Cistercians were particularly advanced, building systems with sluices and filters that kept their water supply pure. It was practical holiness, proving that piety sometimes went hand in hand with plumbing. Unfortunately, this level of engineering didn't spread quickly. Nobles preferred beauty over function, and no one wanted to spend money fixing a problem they couldn't see. You can picture it now, the trickle of water running through unseen channels, the soft hum of droplets falling into dark cisterns, the quiet corruption of stone. The castle was alive, but its veins carried as much poison as life. Every drink, every wash, every bucket carried a risk, and yet no one questioned it. The smell was simply part of existence. Disease was fate, and water was divine, even when it came with a side of sewage. The torchlight reflects off the damp walls, catching glimmers of mineral crust that shimmer like tiny stars. The sound of water deepens as you descend a narrow stairway, leading toward the lower levels where the castle's drainage tunnels merge. Down here the air grows colder, the smell thicker, and the sound louder. This is the castle's underworld, the labyrinth where all water, clean or foul, eventually met its end. It's where the waste of nobles, servants and soldiers alike found common ground, and where the line between sanitation and survival disappeared entirely. The steps spiral downward into the castle's belly, where the air turns thick and damp. The sound of dripping becomes a steady rhythm, echoing through narrow tunnels carved long before plumbing had a name. Down here, beneath the glittering halls and perfumed chambers, lies the medieval underworld, the waste tunnels. This was the part of the castle that nobles pretended didn't exist, but it was just as vital as the great hall above. Every meal, bath and bodily function eventually ended up here, flowing into a system of chutes, pits and trenches that kept the illusion of cleanliness alive. At first glance, the medieval drainage tunnels look remarkably advanced. They were carved from limestone, braced with timber, and angled to guide water and waste downhill. Some even had grates to filter out larger debris. But make no mistake, these weren't the triumphs of early engineering. They were acts of desperation. The goal wasn't sanitation, it was concealment. The waste simply needed to disappear from sight. What happened to it afterward was nature's problem. In many castles, the tunnels ran directly beneath the garderobes, collecting whatever dropped through the chutes. The waste would mix with kitchen runoff, rainwater, and the occasional unlucky rodent before seeping toward the moat or into the surrounding ground. It was a closed ecosystem powered entirely by gravity and denial. When heavy rain hit, these tunnels flooded, forcing their contents back up into the castle. There are written accounts of servants waking to find waste bubbling up through cracks in the floor after a storm. It wasn't divine punishment, it was poor plumbing. Maintenance was constant. Servants known as gong farmers or nightmen were tasked with crawling into these tunnels to clear blockages. It was among the worst jobs in the medieval world. They worked by torchlight, armed with shovels and buckets, often crawling through knee-deep sludge. The air was toxic, filled with methane and sulphur, and one wrong move could ignite an explosion. There are records of such accidents in London's medieval sewers, where entire sections of tunnel collapsed after one unlucky spark. Castles weren't much safer. The workers learned to move slowly, breathing through cloth soaked in vinegar to dull the stench. Their pay was surprisingly high, but no amount of money could wash off the smell that clung to them forever. Not all waste reached the tunnels. Some castles had cesspits instead, large underground chambers where everything collected. These pits could be several meters deep, lined with stone or brick to prevent collapse. Unfortunately, they rarely worked as intended. Over time, waste seeped through the cracks, saturating the soil and releasing gas. When archaeologists excavate medieval sites today, they can still identify old cesspits by the greasy black soil and the distinct absence of worms. Even the earth wanted no part of it. Moats often served as the final destination for this entire system. It's easy to picture the romantic image of knights riding past shimmering waters, banners fluttering in the breeze. The reality was a stagnant, foul-smelling trench that doubled as a sewer. The mixture of decomposing organic matter produced hydrogen sulfide, a gas so potent it could kill small animals. Chroniclers described castle moats as black and bubbling, a phrase that might be poetic if it weren't accurate. During sieges, this foul brew was both a curse and a weapon. Attackers who waded into the water risked infection from even the smallest wound. The moat was medieval biological warfare, unintentional but effective. Some castles took the idea further. At Château de Coucy in France, engineers designed waste chutes that emptied high above the moat, allowing the filth to splash down like a grotesque waterfall. The sound alone must have been memorable. Others incorporated sluices that used rainwater to flush the tunnels periodically. It was clever, but not without consequence. The runoff carried everything into nearby rivers, poisoning fish and towns downstream. Medieval ecology was a shared experience whether you wanted it or not. Despite the filth, there was an odd fascination with these underworld spaces. Chroniclers wrote about them as metaphors for sin, dark, hidden, and unavoidable. In some castles, tunnels were repurposed for storage or even punishment. Prisoners were locked near the waste channels, forced to live in darkness among the stench. It was a psychological torture chamber that required no guards. The smell alone broke most people within days. Yet the same tunnels sometimes doubled as escape routes for the wealthy. A noble could flee through the same passage that once carried their waste, emerging somewhere beyond the walls. Dignity, as it turns out, was optional in a crisis. Even the structure of these tunnels reveals the mindset of the era. Builders understood how water flowed, how pressure worked, and how stone could direct movement. They just hadn't yet made the leap to understanding disease. To them, filth was only dangerous if it was seen or smelled. As long as it was hidden underground, it no longer existed. This philosophy guided sanitation for centuries. The idea that invisibility equaled safety was comforting and disastrously wrong. Life above the tunnels depended on this fragile illusion. The nobility dined on rich meats and heavy sauces, blissfully unaware that their discarded scraps mingled below with human waste. Servants sweeping the floors sometimes dumped buckets directly into the drains, which carried the mixture into the moat. The castle's economy of waste was efficient in the worst possible way. Every part of it was recycled, just not in any way you'd want. When archaeologists study these tunnels today, they find an accidental time capsule. Layers of sediment preserve traces of medieval life, grains of barley from the kitchen, pollen from the gardens, fish bones from feasts, and the seeds of exotic spices imported from distant lands. All of it tells a story of indulgence and decay. The tunnels were the castle's memory, quietly recording everything that passed through it. In some cases, they even helped identify outbreaks of disease. Samples taken from ancient cesspits have revealed the DNA of plague bacteria, confirming that waste channels were silent accomplices in medieval epidemics. You can almost feel the weight of the air down here. Every breath tastes faintly of stone and history. The drip of water becomes hypnotic, a reminder that even filth can find rhythm. This is the part of the castle no minstrel sang about, no painter captured, and no noble visited willingly. Yet it was essential. Without these tunnels, the great halls would have drowned in their own grandeur. As you move deeper into the labyrinth, the walls grow slick and narrow. The torchlight dances across the surface of something carved, a faint inscription in Latin, etched by a mason centuries ago. It reads, "What enters here does not return." A fitting epitaph for the castle's digestive system. The tunnel ahead curves upward, leading back toward the kitchens, where the cycle of consumption begins again. The same hands that carried water down to wash away filth now carry food up to the table. And in the heart of the castle, the two worlds, luxury and waste, feast and rot, meet in quiet balance. The air grows warmer again as you climb, and a faint scent of roasted meat replaces the musty stench below. You've reached the kitchen, the engine that kept the castle alive and the place where cleanliness and contamination danced their strangest waltz. In a world where waste was constant and plumbing primitive, the kitchen wasn't just where meals were made, it was where disease was born, disguised beneath the scent of dinner. The warmth of the kitchen feels almost comforting after the damp tunnels below. The air hums with the sounds of crackling fires, clattering pots, and the murmur of servants shouting orders over the roar of boiling cauldrons. It's chaos, but organised chaos. This is the beating heart of the castle, the place where power, hunger, and hygiene collided every single day. The noble upstairs might have believed themselves above the filth of the lower floors, but everything they ate, every delicacy that reached their jewelled table came from this sweaty, smoky chamber. And the truth is, the medieval kitchen was often just one misplaced ladle away from becoming a breeding ground for disease. The first thing that hits you is the smell. Not just roasted meat or baked bread, but a deep, earthy mixture of grease, ash, and something faintly sour. Kitchens in castles were enormous by medieval standards, often housed in separate wings to reduce the risk of fire. Yet even with open windows and high ceilings, ventilation was a cruel joke. Smoke clung to the rafters and coated the walls in a black film that never truly went away. Combined with the scent of unwashed servants, spilled wine, and spoiled food, the atmosphere was thick enough to taste. Most castles had multiple hearths burning day and night. Great spits turned slowly over the flames, sometimes powered by dogs or small boys running on treadmills called turnspit engines. These children spent hours sweating beside the fire, inhaling smoke while being barked at by cooks to keep turning. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept the feasts coming. The grease that dripped from the roasting meat didn't go to waste either. It was collected, cooled, and reused to grease pans or waterproof leather. Recycling, medieval style. What no one could fully control, however, was where all that grease ended up. Floors were made of stone covered in straw to absorb spills. Over time, that straw turned into a sticky mat of filth that had to be scraped away with shovels. Insects thrived in it, rats feasted on it, and occasionally it caught fire. Many castle kitchens burned down at least once during their history. Fire was an occupational hazard, but so was infection. Cuts, burns, and open wounds were part of the job. With no concept of germ theory, cooks wiped their hands on the same cloths they used to clean knives. A nick on the thumb could turn septic within days, leading to fever, delirium, and a quiet burial near the walls. Food itself wasn't safe either. Refrigeration didn't exist, and preservation relied on salt, vinegar, and luck. Meat hung from hooks near the ceiling, attracting flies. Fish arrived salted or dried, sometimes already smelling suspiciously ambitious. Spices helped disguise the taste of decay, which explains why medieval people adored them. Cinnamon, pepper, and cloves didn't just make food taste exotic, they made it bearable. When nobles sprinkled spices on their meals, they weren't just flaunting wealth, they were hiding evidence of rot. Water in the kitchen came from the same questionable sources that fed the garderobes and cisterns. To kill the taste, cooks often boiled everything in ale or wine, which sounds decadent until you realise it was out of necessity. Soups and stews were the safest meals because prolonged boiling destroyed some bacteria. The downside was that everything eventually tasted like variations of wet bread and onions. Servants who handled water fetched it in wooden buckets, sometimes walking miles to the nearest well or stream. Each trip risked contamination, especially when the same buckets were later used for scrubbing floors or, worse, disposing of chamber pot contents. The kitchen was also where food waste accumulated, and with it came pests. Rats were constant companions, bold enough to scurry across tables during meal prep. Cats were kept to control them, but even they couldn't keep up. Archaeologists studying Castle Refuse heaps have found enormous rat populations thriving on discarded bones and spoiled grain. In some fortresses, rats grew so fearless that they gnawed through pantry doors and even through sleeping soldiers' boots. Yet surprisingly, no one considered them dangerous. Disease wasn't linked to vermin yet, so rats were treated as nuisances rather than threats. The servants who worked here developed their own hierarchy. The head cook was a powerful figure, often feared more than the steward. Beneath them were assistants who prepared dough, butchered animals, and managed spices. Then there were the scullions, the lowest rank. Their job was to wash pots, scrub tables, and empty the scraps. They worked ankle-deep in water and waste, their hands raw from lye and heat. Many slept in the kitchens because it was warm, curling up in corners beside the ovens. The smell never left them, and neither did the soot. Despite the grime, the kitchen was a marvel of efficiency for its time. Large castles like Warwick and Windsor employed systems of flues and drains to carry away smoke and liquid waste. Some even had early grease traps carved into the floor to collect runoff. These innovations sound impressive until you remember that most of them emptied directly into the moat. The same water used to rinse dishes eventually ended up swirling with human waste outside the castle walls. It was a closed loop of culinary optimism. Feasts, the pride of noble life, made everything worse. Preparing a banquet for 50 guests could take days. Dozens of animals were slaughtered, vegetables peeled, dough kneaded, and sauces stirred in open pots. The sheer volume of food created an equal volume of waste. Bones, offal, and uneaten bread piled up behind the kitchen in heaps that sometimes stretched taller than a person. These refuse mounds were breeding grounds for insects and disease, yet no one dared throw them too far away. Waste disposal was a delicate balance between convenience and odour. Too close, and the castle stank. Too far, and the wolves got curious. One of the most overlooked hazards of castle kitchens was lead poisoning. Many cooking vessels were made from lead or pewter, which contained toxic metals. Acidic ingredients like vinegar or wine leached the lead into food, slowly poisoning those who ate it regularly. Chronic symptoms included fatigue, irritability, and stomach pain, traits that conveniently described half of Europe's nobility. Historians now suspect that long-term exposure to lead contributed to the erratic behaviour of several royal families. Dinner, quite literally, made them mad. Yet for all its risks, the kitchen was indispensable. It was where food, warmth and gossip flowed freely. It was the one place where servants from all ranks crossed paths. Even knights occasionally wandered in for a late-night snack, pretending to check on the staff while stealing a crust of bread. In the shadows of the ovens, deals were made, secrets traded, and romances whispered. The kitchen wasn't just the heart of the castle. It was its bloodstream, carrying both nourishment and corruption to every level above. The heat grows oppressive as you stand there, the scent of roasted meat clinging to your clothes. A servant throws another log onto the fire and sparks leap upward into the blackened rafters. Somewhere nearby, you hear the faint rush of water, the drainage channels built beneath the kitchen floors. They carry away everything the cooks can't use, every scrap, every drop, every leftover from the feast. And as you follow the sound, you realise where it leads. Downward again, through the narrow stone passages, toward the outer walls where the castle's most misunderstood invention waits. The moat, the boundary between civilization and filth, wasn't just for defence. It was a medieval sewer with a drawbridge,